Matt, how are you doing?
Hey Ben, I'm doing all right. How about yourself? I like that you're doing the show. Congratulations on the first episode. I'm honored to be the first guest, actually. Very honored
Yeah,
by that.
yeah. Well, I'm excited, and that makes sense to me since so we've interacted so much, since from my debunk segment on TMBS. Before we get into anything else, by the way, since some people might not be clear about the TMBS's future, do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, so David Griscom and Michael's sister Leisha Brooks and I will be sort of carrying on the mantle. We're going to basically continue the show. We're working it out now, how exactly we're going to do it. It's going to take a lot more responsibility from David and I, and it'd be helpful to have Leisha there, kind of giving us the idea of what the family kind of wants. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. I've been, doing a lot more different kinds of reading than I was before,
Mhm.
trying to, because there's like I need to read the book on Thabo and Becky. Michael always wanted me to read. Like it's a big task, but we want to keep these conversations going. So, and I'm sure I can speak for David and saying, Ben, you have an open door to wherever we go with it. So, yeah, thanks for
But
asking.
yeah, much appreciated. Yeah, just want people to know because I think not everybody might be clear that that's still going to be continuing to exist and go on, which I'm really really glad that it is. But speaking of which, since as well as TMBS, you have a role at the Majority Report, and related to that, one of these guys, in fact, the guy who was the subject of that passage that we just read, Bret Weinstein, recently, I think, revealed something interesting about the depths of his commitment to free speech and the free exchange of ideas. I want to just pull up here. Here. Let's do the screen share so people can see this because the whole thing is just amazing.
So in any case, we now have this dynamic, and unfortunately, now what we are seeing is the potential of this mindset to disrupt leadership at a moment when everything seems to be at stake. And as I'm sure we will end up talking about, I had a contact this week, somebody who has been following us for quite some time contacted me. He's actually a Department of Homeland Security officer in Portland. And he contacted me, I think it's fair to say, in something of a panic based on what he is seeing unfold night after night for the last, I guess, 8 nights in Portland, a standoff between the protests and the police. And he frankly is worried about what might emerge from this. And among the possibilities are, a civil war based, in race, and it wouldn't be the first one of those, obviously. And so I really think we have to figure out how to escape the momentum of this moment. And without leaders, I don't know that we can do it, which means I think one of our primary concerns ought to be figuring out what to do when your leaders are trapped in the gig economy. How do you free them to actually do what leaders are supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, the anarchists are actually looking for a massacre. And let me explain to you what I mean by that, because obviously the idea that anybody would seek to be massacred is ludicrous, and it is ludicrous. But you have how many major cities engaged in violent conflict on a daily basis now? If one of those cities sees a massacre, it does the job that the anarchists would like, right? It will be used to illustrate the illegitimacy and the overreaction of the government.
Mm-hmm.
At the point you surrender the idea that I am responsible for achievement, right? I am better off becoming part of a mob than I am being an individual responsible for my own achievement, then this all begins to make sense. The point is, well, the mob will achieve something and then we'll divide it. Well, you know what's going to happen when the mob achieves it? It's going to be divided so unequally, right? If you think...
You think the mob's going to be equitable?
Right.
Really?
That's really the question. If you think the mob is going to be equitable, you don't understand the game theory that underlies mobs. They're taking advantage of you in order to get where they want to go. And as soon as they do, they'll cut you loose, which is, of course, what explains this phenomenon that everybody is now remarking on about the left eating its own. Right? The left eats its own because it is too prone to de-individuation and mob-like behavior. And when the spoils are there to be divided, they're divided the way human beings would be expected to divide them in the absence of a system that aspires to fairness.
There's this clip of Bret Weinstein talking about the situation in Portland. And as people might know, the protests, in Portland, as some of the kind of longest running instances of the continuing embers of the national uprising of protests and riots since the murder of George Floyd, has been met with a pretty severe government response. Not just what we've seen around the country, which has been local cops, beating people up, beating journalists up, firing rubber bullets, at people, who are peacefully protesting. You've seen that all over the place, but in Portland, seen some more disturbing stuff too. There were literally instances of the Department of Homeland Security usurping local law enforcement functions, as well as severely violating people's free speech rights, if that's something we cared about, by using these really like banana republic kind of intimidation tactics where they would grab protesters off the street and shove them into unmarked vans that are obviously designed to make people feel very afraid about going to protests. Mm-hmm. And so you would think that as somebody whose whole brand is built around his dedication to free speech, Bret would be outraged about this, and you'd think that his commentary on this would be devoted to denouncing this and explaining why those of us who care about free speech. Hey, Harvey, I'm going to stick you in the peanut gallery for a minute while I talk to Matt.
I didn't mean to.
No worries, no worries. Gonna pull up Harvey again in a few minutes. But in any case, you'd think that would be his big concern here, right? If there's anything, like whatever we think about threats to free speech from employers, from certain kinds of social ostracism, from things that might cause self-censorship, like the core of free speech is exactly about this, right? Like, exactly about this issue. So you'd think that this would be his big concern here. So what was it?
Well, I mean, his concern throughout this has really been in the rioting sort of thing. And he's sort of, I always talk about it as the sort of, look what you made me do Taylor Swift song, gambit of reactionaries, which is that Bret, he has this, I call it a pose. I don't consider him, I think it's the Dave Rubin, I'm a man who left the left type of thing. I don't want this to be happening, but nonetheless, the weak executive not allowing tear gas is going to facilitate the need for something fatal. And actually so I posted this clip of the episode 21, the June 6th episode of the Dark Horse podcast, of him saying this DHS guy who he said followed him for a while, came up and said, I'm really panicked. And this is just loose quotation here, but I'm panicked about potential race war. And later on in the episode, Bret says, my opinion is that the anarchists who have taken over the Black Lives Matter movement are game theory incentivized to use this moment of weak executive to try to facilitate a race or a massacre somewhere. Maybe not where they are, but they just want one somewhere so then we can really have the revolution. And I thought this was an alarming thing a conversation to have with a DHS agent on June 6th. This was
footnote. It's hilarious that there was the thing about game theory in there, just to kind of give it this paranoid right-wing lunacy about race war, this sheen of intellectualism, that's oh no, but I'm a math nerd, I'm just thinking about game theory.
Yeah. So I took part of this clip, and it's all it starts about 12 minutes in on the June 6th episode. People want to check it out, but I quoted that, and I admittedly a bit facetiously called that his consulting work with DHS. Now he took that as, I guess, borderline slanderous or libel, because he said, he tweeted out, Matt Lech is spreading knowing falsehoods. He said falsehoods.
The falsehood, to be clear, is that he was getting paid for this rather than doing this as a freelance volunteer.
Yeah, I would say it was unpaid consultation and not consulting work. I should have said that. That as a journalist, I should have said that. I agree, because it gave him a little pedantic point to complain about, which is, I think, the pattern of these guys. If I could just go through this. So Dave Rubin complained that a video that I actually titled, but we call him stupid in video too. Like we call Dave Rubin stupid, so he couldn't engage with us in ideas. Fair enough. But we got painted as bad for that. Meanwhile, years later, it looks like Joe Rogan and half the IDW agree with that. And then so we got it. That was the first member of the IDW that demanded an apology of Sam Cedar as a precondition for a conversation. The second was Sam Harris. Because he went on Weinstein's Portal podcast and called Sam a psychopathic troll. This is during us criticizing his bell curve stuff, rehabilitating Charles Murray. And I will just say, the Weinstein brothers are better on the bell curve stuff. They point out why, but they're not explicit in their criticism of who they're criticizing. But I'm just saying, if you would have came to us more directly, we could have had this conversation. You wouldn't have to be distancing yourself from bell curve stuff all these years later.
Just to make sure everybody's listening really knows what you're talking about here, right? Like that's so Charles Murray famously wrote this book back in the 90s with Edward Bernstein called The Bell Curve, where the overall thesis of the book is that the main cause for like economic inequality was that I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think if you slog through the book, you'll find that this is not inaccurate. It's a simplification, but that's all it is. Is that poor people are stupid. And in particular, there's a famous chapter in there where he looks directly at the most obvious counterexample, which is, hey, Black people have been doing economically worse than white people since emancipation. And, you might think that has something to do with slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining. But nope, it's because of difference in IQ. And Sam Harris really ran with this, like after there was some incident where there was a college that Murray was supposed to speak at, and it was disrupted, and there's a whole thing there. But instead of just saying, hey, you shouldn't disrupt speakers, but also Charles Murray is a crazy and terrible person, who's peddling,
who's not a scientist, right? He's
not a scientist in any way.
He's a political agent. Basically.
Yeah, he's a right-wing think tank guy, right? He's not like he spent his entire life in these kinds of institutions putting out right-wing policy books. He's not a scientist. He's just looking for scientific rationalization for the kind of Dickensian economic preferences that he has. And so instead of saying all that, right, Harris really embraced him, said,
debate Ezra Klein on it, which was, everyone should check that out. A pretty amazing debate where he says, Ezra, I can't remember the IQ guy who they both cite, but Ezra at one point cited him saying it could be that, there's so much environmental stuff that we just don't know the genetic component. And Sam Harris is like, yeah, but we're talking about what's plausible here. And I mean, it's a very interesting debate. People should go back and watch
it is.
that.
And actually, it's even better than that, because in that moment, it's like the Marshall McLuhan scene in Annie Hall, that Ezra Klein actually says, this guy you're talking about with this effect, the Flynn effect. That's
Flynn,
right.
Michael Flynn. Or not Michael Flynn, geez. No,
not Michael Flynn, but a different Flynn, a scientist Flynn. And this Flynn, Ezra Klein actually says, I just talked to him last night to see what he thinks about this, and this is what he says. Yeah. And Harris just treats that like it has no bearing, and he's still reading Flynn right. And most of the debate is spent with Klein trying to challenge him on the merits and explain why he's wrong, and Harris whining about how we can't have the conversation, which, you know, kind of sets the tone, right? So,
Yeah.
so after you tweeted this thing about Bret Weinstein's unpaid, unofficial, but friendly conversations with DHS agents worried about race war as the DHS is nabbing protesters off the street and sticking them in unmarked vans.
Or even like right before that happened, actually. That's what made that a bit weird to see, because the nabbings happened a few weeks after. But yeah, go on.
Yeah. So, so you tweeted this, and of course, like an adult, he just tweeted, "Hey Matt, I think the way you put that was slightly inaccurate. Would you
I'd love to come onto the Majority Report and correct the record." that didn't happen.
No, that did not. What happened instead?
He called for me to be fired. He called for me to apologize, retract, and then be fired. Which is like, if I'm gonna be fired, like I'm not gonna do any of that.
All that, first, right?
But I did. I immediately deleted it because, like I said earlier, I wish I hadn't done that. Because, and I just want to get back to this pattern. I got sidetracked with the Sam Harris thing. So Sam Harris, said we won't engage with us because we're psychopathic. He said that our behavior was psychopathic on Eric Weinstein's The Portal. Anyway, flashback to about a week before this happens with Bret Weinstein. Sam Seder is dunking on Eric Weinstein for saying that he understands what it's like to be black because he's neurodivergent, and people tell him he's wrong about things a lot. And Sam says that, hey, Eric, awesome. I know I'm a psychopathic troll, in quotes. I know you think I'm a psychopathic troll, in quotes, blah, 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 blah. And Eric seizes on saying, I have never said you are a psychopathic troll. But I'd be happy to say I'm wrong if you can provide evidence. And he has like the screenshots of like the Boolean operator search terms. It's like, oh, clearly never said it. But again, Sam Harris went onto his show and called us psychopathic. And Eric said, oh, that's what the whole left is doing these days. That was his pushback to that. And then Eric did call us, says our troll game is too strong for him to engage. So that's the third IDW member of the ones profiled by Barry Weiss that demanded an apology as a precondition for discussion. And then a week later, Bret asked for me to. Admittedly, I was provoking him because I think his behavior.
But come on. I mean, like the idea that it's okay to try to get people fired to silence them if the speech is provocative enough.
Right.
Once you said that, it's kind of game over as far as everything these guys are, in some cases, legitimately, right, complaining about. And also, by the way, I just love the idea the person being called psychopathic in this context is that monster Sam Seder, right? Like, that like.
It's so weird. This whole time period is crazy.
Human beings.
Well, to be fair, he does like to fight with these guys, so I understand from their perspective why he presents or appears that way. Because he has a greater appetite than either Michael or I do for this stuff, which is why I'm grateful to work for him. Because Sam, when I tweeted my response to Bret, I tweeted out and I put the video back up, but tweeted out some apologies and some other context. And throughout that entire thing, Sam, I wasn't like talking to Sam. I wasn't coordinating what I can say. I'm confident in my job at the Majority Report, my place there, that Sam's going to have my back, and I appreciate that.
Well,
so.
Yeah, and of course, the idea that you would be coordinating it does get right to the heart of the issue, because a lot of times, again, these guys are clearly not taking it's only censorship if the state doesn't line, right? If they were, there'd be nothing inconsistent about trying to get you fired for a tweet they didn't like. But they're not, right? Because if they were, then like 3/4 of what they object to would be unobjectionable. You could no longer say that you didn't like it, that this editor had to step down, or this professor was investigating. None of that stuff, right? Because none of that is the state. Mm-hmm. So they are obviously concerned about tactics like trying to get people fired to punish them for their speech. And the fact that they're willing to engage in that themselves like this tells you everything about how how serious they are about it, right? That they'll resort to that easily.
Well, he recently said on a more recent episode that this is different because I'm like a drunk pilot, and you can't really have mistakes of this significance. So I guess mischaracterizing and I guess suggesting a more formal relationship between him and the race war panicked Department of Homeland Security officer in Portland, like driving a plane into the Andes Mountains. But
yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, also the suggestion, you're like a drunk pilot, like, I love you, and like, I think you do great work, but I also think that flying an airplane and being a producer for some talk shows maybe aren't really analogous activities.
I don't know. I'll have to think about that one.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also think just as, certainly I think you're less likely to kill people in your line of work. I'll say that much.
I mean, I think so. I mean, to address that point seriously, he says like in this environment, you don't want to be spreading misinformation like that, which I mean, I have some agreement with that sort of thing, which is why I changed my tweet. Now I find it a bit rich that the main journalist he always cites, and immediately after talking about this DHS conversation, is Andy Ngo. That's like his only source on the ground. And I mean, Andy Ngo's been criticized for things he's published about hospitalized protesters and journalists. So, I mean, I think these conversations are valid, but I kind of don't buy it so much from Bret Weinstein in that case. I don't think I really endangered him. I think telling the DHS about anarchists that want to start a race war is also a bit irresponsible in these times.
Yeah, possibly even more irresponsible than not making it clear that he didn't have a title and wasn't being paid for the conversation. But it's also important, and I guess maybe this is like the last point I want to end this on, because above and beyond the fact that they're like weird hypocritical clowns, there's also a more serious thing here, which is that if you are concerned about people using these tactics, like trying to get people fired, for tweeting things you don't like, then if you're not just going to be complaining pointlessly forever, right? You should have some kind of solutions. And I'll also even say some people on the left like err in the direction of not taking those concerns seriously enough. But I also think the left is in a position to have solutions that none of the rest of these, none of these like IDW so-called classical liberal people actually have, because if you really cared about this problem, which I think you should, then gosh, I don't know, maybe you'd like want to reform labor law so we don't have at-will employment and you have to have a cause for being fired, or make it easier to organize labor unions so you'll have like, somebody to defend you, if you're about to be unjustly fired. And, not to like beat this particular dead horse too much, none of those guys ever talk about any of that stuff, at least.
Right. Yeah. One thing I keep thinking about is in all the conservative freak out about the 1619 project, conservatives aren't freaked out enough to air the Adolf Reed critique of it, which is,
yeah, exactly. Right. Like you have, Sam Harris brings Adolf Reed on Waking Up, then I'll believe that he's actually interested.
Right, exactly. Any one of these guys, let's see it happen. I mean, first of all, I think Adolf might be a bit suspect of going on with those guys himself. I don't know. I don't want to speak for him, but I would love to see it happen. I would love to see them extend the invitation. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it'd be understandable if he did, but for a lot of reasons, I love that particular conversation. If for those who haven't read it, a gem from, I believe, The Nation in the 90s is Adolf Reed's original review of the bell curve. He's very funny about it in exactly the ways that you'd expect him to be, and it's worth reading.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was great.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Good luck on the endeavor.
All right. Thanks, man.
See you.